Well, welcome everybody, and thank you very much for making the time on a Saturday to join us for this masterclass on confident Christianity. And the Apostle Peter tells us always to be ready to give an answer for the hope that we have within us, and to do this with gentleness and respect. And it's my prayer today that today's masterclass will help you a little further along that journey. I'm broadcasting to you. I originally come from New Zealand, but we now live, my wife and family now live in the UK. And so we're broadcasting to you today just from north of London in the town of St Albans. So let me make my screen live, and then let's press on with it. Let me start just by saying a little bit about the Confident Christianity course, because this was originally developed by the Christian Medical Fellowship in the UK. Christian Medical Fellowship brings together about 5,000 Christian doctors and medical students throughout the whole of the British Isles to live and to speak for Jesus. And we developed this course originally and have used it to train thousands of medical students and doctors in how to give an account of their faith and to how to share Jesus, learn the skills of evangelism and apologetics. Now, the course is normally taught over about 8 hours or so, either in a day conference format or over a residential weekend, and it is very interactive. Now, you won't see much of that today because we're compressing a much bigger course into much smaller format for ELF. And there are 20 modules in the course altogether. We'll just be using 10 of those today. And normally we spend about 20 or 30 minutes per module. Each one is going to be an average of about 10 minutes today. And the way the format would work is that we will we'll do 2 modules at a time. So I'll do one after the other, and then we will stop for 10 minutes or so of Q&A, where Jamie and I will have a dialogue attempting to answer the questions that you've raised and that you've typed in into your Q&A feature along the bottom of your screen. So you can do that at any time you like. So we won't, because of the format and the time, have any small group interaction today. We'll be looking up Bible verses in great detail, although I'll be making mention of a lot. But as we go along, I'll also indicate how I go about teaching it in a longer format. And our hope and dream really is that you will be able to take this material and use it in your churches and youth groups and charity groups and so on to train others. And so I'll indicate the interaction exercises as we go along that you'll be able to see. And when you get the slides, which we will send to you in the next week or so, you will get a full PDF of the PowerPoint that I'm using. So please, as we go, just concentrate more on listening and thinking. You can take some notes if you like, but you will get the full PowerPoint presentation in PDF format after the session when we write to you. And also the videos that we do today are all available already on a YouTube playlist, and we'll also give you the details for that later on. So you will find at times that we're going very quickly through things because of the limitations of the time we have and the format we have, but there is an opportunity to go back over it, spend more time on it later. So let's kick off then with module number 1, which is understanding worldviews. And everybody on the planet has a worldview. In other words, they have a set of assumptions and presuppositions that they hold when looking at and interacting with the world. Many people are not aware either that they have a worldview or what it is, but they have a perspective through which they look at the world, rather like looking at the world through a set of glasses. And this profoundly shapes the way they interpret the world. It's a collection of beliefs, if you like, about life, the universe, and everything that is held by an individual or by a group of individuals. Now, if we think of an iceberg, you know that 9/10 of an iceberg is under the water. You can't see it. You can only see the 10% that is above the water. And worldviews are useful to think about like this. So right under the depths of the sea is the worldview, the set of assumptions. And this leads to a number of beliefs that the person holds. And these beliefs shape a person's values, what they consider to be right and wrong, good and bad. And these values and beliefs together shape the words they speak and the behaviors they exhibit. So they shape the question, how do I live in the light of my worldview, beliefs and values? Now, of course, often all that we can see is the 10%, the behaviors and the words above the world, but above the surface of the ocean, but we are aware of what's happening beneath it. And you can diagnose or work out a person's essential worldview by asking 6 fundamental questions. It's a bit what we doctors would call making a worldview diagnosis. And these are the questions on this page here. So first of all, what is God? Does God exist even? Is God personal or impersonal? Could God interact with the world? Is God just a life force of which we're all a part? Then what are human beings? Are they just the product of matter, chance, and time in a godless universe, just clever monkeys? Or are they part of the whole totality of being? Or are they special creations made in the image of God for a relationship with God? That's the anthropology question. What's the best way to discover truth? Is it only through observations based on our 5 senses and the information they give us? Or are there other ways to access truth, perhaps through meditation or through revelation, through scriptures, through prophecies? Number 3. Number 4, why do human beings have significance if we believe that they do at all? Do they have more significance than a rock or a snail, for example? And if so, why? Is it due to the amount of cognitive capacity they have, their intelligence, or is it because they are made for a relationship with God? Then the ethical question, how do we decide what's right and wrong? What is good and bad? What's the framework? What are the standards of ethics that we bring to it? And then finally, the question, what happens to a person at death? Is death the end? Or does death lead to some kind of dismembered existence of the soul, whatever that is? Or does death lead to reincarnation so that we come back into this world again? Or does death lead to judgment, that we only die once and then go either to heaven or hell on the basis of decisions and choices we've made in this life? So those are the 6 questions that determine a worldview, which you can ask people and work out where they stand. And if we ask these questions, we find that people generally fall in one of 4 categories. Now, I'm oversimplifying this a little, but it's a useful way to think about it. First are the pantheists. This is the worldview behind Hinduism, behind Buddhism, and behind the New Age, in which God is an impersonal life force of which we're all a part. Reincarnation is a strong part of this worldview. Then there's polytheism, the belief in the existence of many gods. And this was the worldview behind many of the ancient civilizations. The Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, the Babylonians were all polytheists. And there are polytheists in the world today, following tribal religions or animism or folk religion, distortions of some of the other big religions. And then the third category is theism, belief in one God. And of course, the 3 great religions of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity fall in that category. And then finally, atheism, belief in no God at all, nothing beyond what we can see, feel, and touch. And there are different strands of atheism as well: naturalism, existentialism, nihilism, and so on. So 6 questions would divide people into 4 major worldviews. And if we look at these in a little bit more detail, we'll just look here at theism and atheism. But if you look at the 6 questions down the left-hand column there, the nature of God, man, truth, value, morality, and death. Then theism, so that's Islam, Christianity, Judaism, belief in a personal supreme God, that human beings are made in some sense in God's image, carrying some of God's qualities. that truth is absolute and revealed by God through scriptures or prophets or in some other form of revelation, that human beings have value because they're created by God for a relationship with him. And morality is what resonates with God's character and nature and is revealed in the form of commandments. And death, well, it leads to judgment. We only die once, and after that comes judgment and either heaven or hell. So that's the theistic worldview. Now let's just, in the interest of time, skip to the far right here. Atheism, by contrast, God doesn't exist. As we've been hearing, atheism, secularism is the fastest growing worldview in Europe at the moment. God doesn't exist. Human beings are just clever monkeys, just another species on the planet that's been more fortunate and competitive. That truth is discovered only through the senses because there's no God, there's no such thing as revelation. Human beings' value and morality is in some sense arbitrary, dependent upon the individual, and death that leads to nothing. So as Bertrand Russell, the famous atheist, said, when I die, I rot. Death is the end. So 6 questions, 4 worldview categories. And at this point, if I was doing a longer schedule with people, I'd break them up into small groups and get them to talk about what is the most common worldview in their cultural setting and why. And working with ICMDA, where we have doctors from 80 different countries around the world, you can be sure that we get some very interesting answers there, because people come from extremely different cultural settings where different worldviews dominate. Now, if we look at worldview distributions, very interesting. If we look at the whole world, then atheists only make up 13%, pantheists 20%, most of whom are in the Indian subcontinent, polytheists about 10% altogether, and by far the overwhelming majority of people in the world are theists, either Christians or Muslims, with some Jews amongst them. Now, if you look at any particular country, you'll see that the breakdown of worldviews is different. As we've been hearing, atheism is dominant in Europe at the moment. I worked, before I was the CEO of Christian Medical Fellowship, I worked as head of student ministries there. And I can tell you that among British medical students, about 2/3 of them are atheist, about 1/3 are theists, spread more or less in equal parts between Muslims and Christians, and about 5% are pantheists. Most of those are people from the Indian subcontinent, and virtually no polytheists at all. So every culture, every country will have a different worldview distribution. 6 questions, 4 worldview categories. So what do we learn from all this? Well, we learn, first of all, that there are at least 4 different worldviews. As I've said, I've simplified it slightly. All of them are held by intelligent, well-educated people, both today and throughout history as well. The Greeks, the Romans, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians, and the Egyptians who lived in the past were no less intelligent than us. They were educated in a different system, and they were virtually all, without question, polytheists. Very different today. The worldviews are mutually exclusive. No more than one of them can be true. We can't say that death leads both to nothing and to a dismembered existence of the soul and to judgment and to reincarnation. Clearly, no more than one of those things can be right. And so it follows that no more than one of these fundamental worldviews can be true. And what that means is that many intelligent people hold to a worldview that is not actually true. In other words, many people on the planet have a whole set of beliefs that are false, and yet they hold them with great conviction. So that's a quick tour through worldviews. Now let's think about the distinctives of Christian theism next, and we're distinguishing this from Islamic theism and also Jewish theism. And at this point, I would break people into small groups again and ask them to brainstorm the idea, what makes Christianity distinct from all the other religions, not just Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, and so on, but also Islam and Judaism. and get them to discuss that in small groups. Then they come back after about 10 minutes or so and feedback their answers in plenary. And I'm not looking here for the moral qualities or ethical qualities of Christianity, although we could talk a lot about that, but I'm talking about the fundamental beliefs or the worldview that is behind Christian theism. And so I'll get people to feedback, and then we'll look at some of these things. And on this slide here, you see what I think are the main things that make Christian theism distinct, not from just all the other religions, but also from Islam and Judaism. First of all, is the authority of the scriptures of the Bible, both Old and New Testament, that we believe they are written, that they are the written word of God revealing his will, and that they are true in what they reveal. Second, we believe in the Trinity, that God exists in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And of course, that means that Jesus Christ himself, God the Son, is divine, and not taught by any other religions. That Christ is the only way of salvation. One cannot come to God by any other means. We believe in Jesus's death and in his bodily resurrection as well, so that he rose with a real body that could be seen and felt and touched, that could light fires and eat fish. Absolutely distinct to Christianity, that belief. Very different from other afterlives. The centrality of the cross, that Christ's death in our place on the cross was necessary for our salvation and our forgiveness. And then finally, salvation by grace through repentance and faith. In other words, that we receive our salvation as a gift. There's nothing that we can do to earn it. We must turn from our sins, put our trusting obedience in God, and then we will be saved. So those are the things that makes Christian theism distinct. And fundamental to all of them is the divinity of Christ. And the divinity of Christ is taught thoroughly throughout the scriptures, both Old and New Testaments. Now, it's taught explicitly in at least 8 passages in the New Testament, which I've listed here. Remember how John's Gospel begins. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So these scriptures explicitly teach the divinity of Christ, that Jesus Christ was God. But also the divinity of Christ is taught implicitly. In other words, it is implied in a whole lot of other scriptures by the things that they say about what Jesus said and did. So we're told, first of all, that he created the world. Of course, only God does that. That unlike any other human being, he existed before his birth. Jesus talks about sharing the glory of God before the world was made. He claimed he was the only way to God. At least 3 parts in the New Testament talk about that exclusive route. We cannot come to the Father by any other means. He claimed to reveal the Father, said to Philip, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. He claimed to be the Son of God, which was a messianic title in the Old Testament, only applied to God. And he called himself I am. He used the tetragrammaton, the YHWH Hebrew word translated Yahweh or Jehovah, and applied it directly to himself, especially in the I am statements in the book of John's Gospel. He claimed to be one with God. I and the Father are one, he says in John 14. He accepted worship. Now that's very interesting, because if Jesus had been merely a prophet, as Muslims tell us, then when people bowed down and worshipped him, as Thomas did, we're told at the end of Matthew's Gospel, then he would have said, no, you can't worship me, I'm only a prophet. But he didn't. He accepted the worship. That's an implicit claim to divinity. He accepted the title Lord, the tetragrammaton. He forgave sins. You remember how this upset the Pharisees, because only God has the authority to do that. He claimed that he would rise from the dead repeatedly, 3 chapters of Mark, almost at the same verse, one after the other. And he said he would return as judge. And of course, only God is the judge. So both explicitly and implicitly, the divinity of Christ is absolutely central and unique to Christianity. So this raises the question, well, how do we think of other religions then? And what we have to say at the outset is that many other religions teach things that are true. And we'll come back to that question later and how it can be used in evangelism. Many other religions teach some things that are true. We know that a lot of Islam's beliefs are true. But like a counterfeit banknote, every other religion has central teachings which are false and deny the fundamental beliefs and doctrine which make Christianity unique. So in other words, they are counterfeits. And of course, the thing about a counterfeit is that it looks very, very much like the real thing, which is why people are so easily fooled by it, because it will resemble the real article in almost every respect, apart from a few fundamental differences. But those differences render a banknote absolutely valueless. And in the same way, whilst we may hold that some other religions and worldviews hold beliefs that are true, they are counterfeits because they deny the fundamental teachings of Christianity. So let's pause there. So we've looked at modules 1 and 2. Worldviews, what are they? The 6 questions to ask, the 4 categories of worldviews, and then what makes Christian theism distinctive. And all of this is fundamental to establishing the foundation that we're going to build on as we go forward. So we're going to stop now for our first time of questions when Jamie and I will chat with the questions that you put in. You can still add new ones in at the moment, and then we'll carry on with module 3 in about 10 minutes time. So let me just stop my sharing and come back to you, Jamie.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Our first question is, according to you, what is driving the rise of atheism in Europe?
Well, it's very interesting. I think there are probably 3 major factors historically. If we go back about 300 or 400 years, then the overwhelming majority of people were theists. If we go back just a century or more, we still find that the overwhelming majority of people were at least deists. They believe in a creator God, even if they didn't think he was intimately involved in the world. But there were 3 fundamental things, I think, that dismantled theism as a worldview in the minds of many. And the first of those was biblical criticism. So in the early 19th century, a number of theologians started to dismantle the New Testament, claiming that it wasn't historically correct or that it was full of contradictions and so on. Now, we don't believe that, but it had a major effect on people's beliefs. Secondly was the theory of evolution, 1859, from Charles Darwin, his Origin of the Species. And of course, Christians hold different views on that issue. But the thing is that the theory of evolution made atheism intellectually respectable in a way that it never was before, because it gave an alternative explanation for biological complexity. And then I think the third major plank was a movement we know as the Enlightenment, late 18th century, which really replaced divine revelation with human reason as the source of authority. So I think these 3 things acting together in the 19th century, and then coming on into the 20th century, we find that a culture will change when its major mountains, if you like, or foundations are taken over by people with a particular worldview. And by the foundations or mountains of society, I mean things like parliament, the judiciary, the worlds of media and entertainment, the education, the institutions, business, and so on. When these big institutions and foundations become occupied by people who have a particular worldview, then the whole culture tends to follow that trajectory. And I think that's what's been happening here. You can monitor the change of worldview in Europe, particularly in Britain, by just following the number of people who attend Sunday school. Back in the 1860s, it was about 70% of all children went to Sunday school. By the year 1900, it would fall into 50%. It fell dramatically in the 60s, in particular the 1960s. And so by the year 2000, it was about 3%. So we have a whole population who are being brought up without any understanding of the Christian worldview or meta-narrative, and that's how the culture has shifted. But I think the real, so that those three foundations, as I mentioned, Darwin's theory of evolution, biblical criticism, and the Enlightenment. But then particularly there was a big change in the 1960s in the culture. So we're living now largely in a post-Christian culture.
Thank you, Peter. Our next question is, how much of atheism is militant, like Richard Dawkins, and how much is casual or by default?
Well, I think a lot less atheism is militant than we might imagine, but the militant atheists tend to be much more vocal. So I think if we look at those who occupy the mountains of culture, who's in parliament, who's on the media, who's in the world of entertainment, what are celebrities saying, what are scientists saying, what are people in universities teaching, it's they who have a disproportionate effect. So that what is whispered, if you like, in the ivory towers of the university in one generation gets shouted in the streets in the next. But I think there are still a majority of the population who, although they might not be Christian or even deist or theist in worldview, are not hostile and are much more open to Christianity. And you could argue that it's always been that way. If we go back to the first century, we find that the real opposition to Christianity came from the institutions. It came from the leaders of the Jewish faith. It came from the Roman leaders and so on. And it was much more among the common people and the poor that the Christians found a ready ear to listen. So I think we think that it's far more hostile than it is, simply because those who are most vocal are hostile.
Thank you. Our next question is, do you feel that the pandemic will bring about a rise of atheism as many people are disconnecting from the church?
Well, that's a fascinating question. I think what we haven't yet seen in Europe, certainly, which I think a lot of Christians were praying for, was a revival because of the suffering brought about by the pandemic. And we haven't seen, of course, always what precedes revival is conviction of sin. I don't think we've seen this in a big way. But the reports from churches are variable. Some churches are saying that they're seeing a lot more openness to the gospel. More people are attending a church service online than would ever come. And people have become Christians through it. So I'm a great believer in God's sovereignty. God works for good through all things. He's sovereign over the pandemic, and he will use it for his glory. And that will mean, as in every age, that some people are drawn to him and some people are repelled by him as a result. So I don't, of course, there are elements of the pandemic that are threatening and frightening, but behind every dark cloud of threat, there is a silver lining of opportunity as well, which I think the church can exploit in a good way. And I think the pandemic is causing a lot of people to ask very deep questions about the meaning of life, about suffering, about the future, about human solutions and so on.
Great, thank you. Our next question points out that many people feel that Christians are not as educated as those who are scientists. So what do we say to those that feel that Christians are intellectually and psychologically weak?
Well, it's simply not true if one looks at the data, and a disproportionately large number of Christians are scientists and occupying leading positions in universities. I'd say it's really just the cultural arrogance of our 21st century world, in the same way that we could look back at past worlds and say that the Babylonians, Greeks, Persians, and Egyptians and so on weren't intelligent because they weren't atheists. Well, that's different. They just held to a different set of worldviews. And the fundamental question really is, what is the correct worldview? And when we look at all the evidence and evaluate it, that many people, many different persuasions have come to the conclusion that Jesus Christ really is God. He really did visit the earth. He really did die on a cross and rise from the dead, that he's at the right hand of God, is coming back at judgment, and that the Christian worldview is the one fundamentally that makes sense of more of the world than any other. So I think that's nonsense, really.
Okay, we have time for one last question. So it is, what is the best way to battle other worldviews, in your opinion?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm not going to give a long answer to it because we're going to come up against that question later. And it's right near the end in the module on the process of persuasion, where we talk about how best to approach people who have a different worldview than us in trying to encourage them to consider Christianity. And in a nutshell, the answer is that we've identified what in their worldview is correct and start with agreeing with them, and then move on to the things that are different, and then ultimately to present Christ. But I'll unpack that in a lot more detail later. Thanks very much, Jamie. So that's modules 1 and 2. Let me just share my screen again, and we'll press on.